David Mansfield.
Good evening. What are your priorities for making Britain a safer country and the world a safer place?
Thank you. What are your priorities for making Britain a safer country and the world a safer place? Angus Robertson.
Well, the first thing is, I imagine at the forefront of your minds, and I'm sure I speak for all of my colleagues here, at the forefront of all of our minds are all of the families who suffered the devastation to their loved ones and relatives with the attack on Manchester. What happened there was a horror, and sadly it's happening far too often, both here and round about the world. So I think the first thing that we need to do is that we do need to take safety and security seriously. We need to invest in the police, not cut them as has been the case in England. In Scotland, we've managed to maintain police numbers, so that's my first step. Let's make sure we back the police, give the resources that they need, back our intelligence services who do a tremendous job. There's been some discussion, has there not, about the link between UK foreign policy and becoming perhaps a terrorist threat, and I think that's a dangerous link to draw. However, I would say this. I think we are right to question our intervention in different parts of the world, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. And the lesson I draw from that is not that it is wrong sometimes to intervene. We agreed that helping people in Libya was a good thing. But what was wrong was spending 13 times more bombing that country than helping to rebuild it, and leaving areas of the world with ungoverned spaces is where terrorism and extremism thrives. So we need to do everything that we can to counter extremist thought, give the police and security service the tools that they require. So not cutting the police would be a first step that I would take from Scotland's experience. And I think we want to be very cautious about how we intervene internationally. And if we're going to do it, we have to think long and hard about how we make sure that those places remain stable and safe for years to come.
Jeremy Corbyn, you have talked about our foreign interventions and our safety here at home.
What happened in Manchester was unbelievably abominable in every way. Innocent lives were taken of mainly young women out enjoying themselves. I want to live in a country that protects the right of people to go out and enjoy themselves at any town or any city in this country. The consequences of that are appalling for those families, and I hope those that are perpetrated this act are all discovered and brought to book. But there's also a question we have to ask about the number of police officers. Under Amber Rudd's time in the Home Secretary and Theresa May before that, 20,000 police officers have lost their jobs. There are fewer police officers around than there were 7 years ago, and those cuts are going to continue. I think it's important that we restore that. What I also think, if I may say so, is the point that Angus was alluding to about terror threats and other threats to our security. There are terrorist threats, obviously. There are also cyber attacks threats, as the National Health Service discovered. It's also important that we recognise that leaving large spaces of, for example, Libya, ungoverned, leaves an opportunity for those who wish to do harm to an awful lot of people, a space in which to develop to do that harm. If you intervene somewhere, the consequences go on for a very long time. And I think we have to think it through. But I'm not saying...
Without the police cuts, are you saying the attack in Manchester wouldn't have happened?
No, I'm absolutely not saying that. The attack in Manchester happened because somebody decided that they had... They wanted to go and kill a large number of people for some perverted belief in their minds. They have to be dealt with, and those people that were under threat have to be protected. What I'm also saying is, though, it would be extremely unwise for any government to ignore, any government anywhere in the world, to ignore what is happening in Libya, where large areas are left ungoverned and very dangerous forces are arising there. What we need to do is recognise the human rights and justice of people all around the world and be prepared to support them, not just go in and bomb and do nothing about it afterwards, which is what happened in Libya.
You've said... Just quick point of fact before I turn to Amber Rudd. Diane Abbott has talked about 10,000 more police officers. You're saying 20,000.
No, I said 20,000 have been cut by the Conservative government,
So you would bring
we
back
would put
10.
10,000 more on. What I would also want to add,
You
and I think
also
it's
said
important,
restore.
is the response of people in this country to what happened in Manchester. I was in Manchester straight after the event took place, and Tim was there as well, and Amber. The most amazing sense of community unity came together. They were not going to allow that individual who killed those people to divide our communities. They were going to be united in response to it. Just remind you that in 2005, Theresa May voted against the anti-terrorist legislation at that time. And she voted against it, as did David Davis, as did a number of people that are now in your cabinet, because they felt that that legislation was giving too much executive power. My opposition to anti-terror legislation isn't opposition to protecting us from terrorism. It is simply saying there must be judicial oversight over what is done in our name.
You said you were going to roll back state surveillance powers by ending the indiscriminate bulk collection of communications data. Now, that was before Manchester. Do you still stand by that as the right thing to do?
Yeah, if you look at the security services, what do they need? Do they need more powers, or do they need to make use, or be given the resources to make use of the powers they already have? The temporary exclusion orders, which exist now, only one has been used in the last 2 years. But undoubtedly, the shadow that we are standing in now is that of Manchester. And Manchester is my capital city. It matters to me. As Jeremy said, I was there the night afterwards. All 4 of my kids knew people who were in Manchester that night. And it just reminds you of how safe our police and our security services keep us, the countless times that those kinds of outrages had been prevented. So to answer the question, how do you deal with it? How do you tackle that terrorism? Well, we will give an additional £300 million to police to make sure that we deal with the community policing that is so necessary. We will also ensure that we restart engagement with communities where terrorism can be fostered, so you get on the inside to prevent it and nip it in the bud. But there is undoubtedly an international angle to this too. And here's the thing. The terrorists that hate Britain, do you know what? They hate Belgium. They hate France. They hate Germany. They hate our way of life. They hate everything that we stand for. And just as we in Manchester stood together against terrorism, and across Britain we stand together against terrorism, so we must stand together with our neighbours, not just in this continent, around the world, with shared values to fight it. And that will mean diplomacy. That will mean all sorts of things, but sometimes it will take real, serious action. Sometimes it might even mean military action. You have to do the tough thing to defeat the terrorists.
Paul Nuttall.
Well, it's quite clear that the war in Iraq and the bombing of Libya was fundamentally wrong, because all we were doing is we were removing, yes, evil dictators, but it was quite clear that what was going to come next was going to be even worse. But that isn't, our foreign policy isn't an excuse for what went on in Manchester, and what politicians need to do is at least have the courage to name what it is. It's Islamist extremism.
Sorry.
Okay? It's Islamist extremism. But nobody sees...
Let him have his.
Tim, you've just had a diatribe, so, you know, let's crack on.
It's your turn for a diatribe.
It's Islamist extremism. Nobody seems to have the courage to say what it is. How we solve it? Well, we put 20,000 police officers back on the beat, 4,000 more on the border force. We tighten our borders, 7,000 new prison officers, because radicalisation is rife within our prisons. And I must say, I can't believe that we've allowed 350 jihadis to return to our country from Libya and Syria. I'm sorry, if you go out and fight or support Islamic State, you should have your passport revoked and you should never be allowed back into this country. Now, what we've also got to do is look at radicalisation within our own mosques. And I will say, Amber, I think you need to look at Saudi and Qatari funding of mosques in this country. And finally, we need to get the Muslim community itself to sign up to the PREVENT programme. Only 1 out of 8 referrals to PREVENT come from within the Muslim community.
You know that the murderer
rebuild
last
trust
Monday,
and confidence in PREVENT.
You know, Paul, that the murderer last Monday was reported 5 separate occasions by the Muslim community. They want our safety as much as anybody else.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, thank you to David for the question, and it's an incredibly important question. And let me be very clear to begin with that people who commit the kind of atrocities like the one in Manchester are barbaric, and what they stand for is evil. But the best form of defence against attacks like that is intelligence-led policing and community engagement. And the kind of response we've just heard from Paul, which seems to suggest that the violence in Manchester was somehow representative of Islam, I think is completely outrageous. There is no more representative of Islam than the murder of Joe Cox was representative of the wider British public. So listen, I'm deeply concerned about the police cuts we've already talked about, and it's interesting that the Police Federation warned that those police cuts could be very dangerous. But I also think it's right that we review our interventions overseas. I think it's a disservice to democracy to pretend there's no link and to close down the debate. The former head of MI5 herself has said that the invasion of Iraq exacerbated the terror threat to the UK and was, in her words, highly significant in terms of homegrown extremists. But what I want to say actually is something to Amber, because we can't solve all the world's problems, but we can at least stop adding to them. And my question is this, really, that why is Britain the second biggest arms dealer in the world? Why are we selling to 22 of the 30 countries on the government's own human rights watch list? Why did we make 10 times more in arms sales to Saudi Arabia than we gave to Yemen in aid?
Amber,
I genuinely wonder how you sleep at night knowing those figures.
No
of this being good for industry.
No,
this is absolutely leading to many deaths.
There does need to be some reviewing going on. We need to look at foreign policy. We need to look at the prevent strategy. It is a fact that policing has been cut by 20%, including when Theresa May was in the Home Office, and it's a question of priorities. We should be investing in police and other public services. Those are the people running into the dangerous situation when everyone else is running away.
And that point's been repeatedly made. When you say we should look at what we're doing, what would you do differently in terms of tackling extremism?
Well, I think in terms of the cuts to public services, that's had an impact. If you just take one small example, youth work. When you had a well-funded youth service, there were youth workers available to challenge the ideology of young people if it was going in the wrong.
Are you saying austerity has made us less safe?
I'm saying austerity has cut youth workers, and there are fewer people around to challenge the root cause, the ideology that spurs these people on. I used to work as a probation officer. Can I just finish making this point? I used to work as a probation officer. If we are interested in tackling the root cause of this problem, we have to understand what it is, we have to understand those ideological drivers, and they have to be challenged by people qualified to be able to do that. And by cutting youth workers and other public services, then you are reducing your ability to do that. And that is one of the reasons we are less safe.
We have a small amount of time left. Can you be brief, Tim Farron?
There's an awful lot of truth in it. I think the thing we need to remember, particularly when everything is so raw, just 9 days after Manchester, that there's a lot of finger-pointing going on. We all have ideas, and there's some of them different, some of them similar. The critical thing we should remember at this point is that knee-jerk new policies and new laws tend to do more harm than good. More resources for the security services and the police we have already will do a lot more good than harm.
Thank
and
you.
our best response to the terrorists is the defiance of keeping on.
I mean, of course. I mean, the vast majority of Muslims in this country are peaceful, they add to our economy, they're great for our culture, but there is a tiny minority within that community who hate who we are, hate the way we live, hate our democracy, and I've called it a cancer in the past. Radical Islam is a cancer and it needs to be cut out. If not, there'll be more attacks like Manchester.
And you haven't ruled out locking up suspected terrorists.
Sorry?
You haven't ruled out locking up suspected terrorists without trial. Would that really make us safer?
Well, frankly, I've said nothing should be taken off the table. As far as I'm concerned, you know, when MI5 tell us that there's a possible 23,000 jihadis out there who want to do us harm, I'm sorry,
they hate our freedom
I
and our
was always,
liberty.
let me
Let's
finish.
not give away our freedom and our liberty.
Very briefly, Angus Robertson and
British
then
lads
Jeremy
over the
Corbyn.
human rights of any jihadi any day.
Thank you.
I remember the question was about terrorism and extremism, and you notice that UKIP went straight for Muslims.
Yeah.
We remember it wasn't, it's my time to speak, not my time to speak. It wasn't a Muslim who shot Joe Cox, one of Jeremy's Labour MP colleagues. It was a British right-wing neo-Nazi. Who was it who gunned down kids in Norway? It was a Norwegian white racist neo-Nazi. There are all kinds of threats, and we need to combat all kinds of
Jeremy Corbyn.
The response of the The response to the people of Manchester was absolutely magnificent. All communities of all faiths came together. And I utterly deplore the language that Paul Nuttall uses and the subliminal attack the whole time on people of Muslim faith in what you say.
You invited Hamas. You invited Hamas to the House of Commons and called them your friends.
Paul, if I may just complete a sentence. Thank you.
To the House of Commons.
I think we have to recognise we live in a multi-faith, multicultural society. An attack on any religion is totally unacceptable, and we should recognise that we should bring people together and have much stronger communities as a result.
Particular question.